Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the science of the idea in and for itself, billahi that, walillahi jama'a, Chapter 9, third subdivision of logic, the doctrine of the notion, quasi-subdivision B, the object. Encyclopedia section 194. The object is immediate being because, insensible to difference, which in it has suspended itself, it is further a totality in itself, whilst at the same time as this identity is only the implicit identity of its dynamic elements, it is equally indifferent to its immediate unity. It thus breaks up into distinct parts, each of which is itself the totality. Hence, the object is the absolute contradiction between a complete independence of the multiplicity and the equally complete non-independence of the different pieces. The definition, which states that the absolute is the object, is most definitely implied in the Leibnizian monad. The monads are each an object, but an object implicitly representative, indeed, the total representation of the world. In the simple unity of the monad, all difference is merely ideal, not independent or real. Nothing from without comes into the monad. It is the whole notion in itself, only distinguished by its own greater or less development. Nonetheless, this simple totality parts into the absolute multiplicity of differences, each becoming an independent monad. In the monad of monads, the pre-established harmony of their inward developments, these substances are in like manner again reduced to ideality and unsubstantiality. The philosophy of Leibniz therefore represents contradiction in its complete development. As Fichte in modern times has especially and with justice insisted, the theory which regards the absolute or God as the object and there stops expresses the point of view taken by superstition and slavish fear. No doubt God is the object, and indeed the object out and out, confronted with which our particular or subjective opinions and desires have no truth and no validity. As absolute object, however, God does not therefore take up the position of a dark and hostile power over against subjectivity. He rather involves it as a vital element in himself. Such also is the meaning of the Christian doctrine, according to which God has willed that all men should be saved and all attain blessedness. The salvation and the blessedness of men are attained when they come to feel themselves at one with God, so that God, on the other hand, ceases to be for them mere object, and in that way an object of fear and terror, as was especially the case with the religious consciousness of the Romans. But God in the Christian religion is also known as love, because in his Son, who is one with him, he has revealed himself to men as a man amongst men, and thereby redeemed them. All which is only another way of saying the antithesis of subjective and objective is implicitly overcome, and that it is our affair to participate in this redemption by laying aside our immediate subjectivity, putting off the old Adam, and learning to know God as our true and essential self. A point of theology from my Presbyterian learning. There is a position in the Roman hierarchy where a man takes the role, a, a man is born into a family and is qualified to become the priest or the lead priest of Jupiter, who is the high god in most traditions. You also have El, who is also referred to as Saturn. So Jupiter, uh, in I'll give you a story. There was the mother of Dionysus, who is also called Bacchus, who believed that the man she was married to, and a man at that time, and even to this day, may have more than one wife, though not all the wives may be happy about it, uh, that she was with a man who was actually Jupiter, and he had the spirit of Jupiter. And so they were married, and she had a child, or she was pregnant with a child, and that child would become Dionysus or Bacchus. Jupiter's lead wife, the queen of heaven, Hera, was unhappy about this relationship and also wanted to teach the young lady something. She asked her, "How do you know that this man is Jupiter?" And she, as anyone would say, "Well, I believed him when he said so. I want you to do something by leave of the Queen of Heaven, Hera. I want you to ask this man to reveal himself. If he is really Jupiter, put off his human elements and show you his divine self." She agreed, and once you agree with the goddess, you do your best not to disagree. So she went to her husband and asked him, "Are you Jupiter, as you say?" He says, "Of course I am. I am Jupiter. I'm Zeus." And she says, "Well, how do I know?" And he says, "You believe in me that I am Jupiter." And she says, "Well, I demand that you show me your true self." And this is something that happened also with Moses. He asked the one who said, "I am that I am," to show himself, and in being told that you couldn't take my real appearance, he asked again, and it said that God showed him his backside, meaning he was not, he couldn't, his face would have been so overwhelming, it would have caused potentially death. So he showed him himself from behind. And Moses and the children of Israel were knocked out unconscious for a time. And so this lady asking Jupiter to show himself, he agrees. And then he manifests his true appearance in all of his beauty and all of his brawn and all of his lights and in whatever magical realities he was. And she saw him and she burned up completely in the magnificent light of Jupiter. And he reached and saved the child that she was carrying. He opened up uh, a, a, a wound in his thigh, and he placed his baby son in his thigh and sewed it up so he can continue to gestate and grow. And so he gave birth after a time to Dionysus himself once the lady had perished because of this. So within the Jewish tradition, there is a book called Shar uh, Hagulim, which discusses how at least three parts of the soul, the nefesh, the ruach, and the neshama, even though they're one, there are also these three. They can descend down into a body, and each goes through a process of clarification and cleansing. And once it does that, the person often dies and waits for another opportunity to arrive again to complete the process for the other two levels. Or there are prayers one can make that if you are able to cleanse your, uh, let's say, your lowest soul, your nefesh, in one lifetime or shorter, you could begin bringing down um, other parts of your soul, your ruach, your neshama, and cleanse them as well by exchanging them out during the evening, as you would say you have three t-shirts. You wear one, clean it, and then let it dry and wear another one. So it is then once that has occurred, or even intermediate between that, you can get other nefesh, ruach, and neshama to alight upon you, and they will help you with your work. Oftentimes, people pray to a saint or to a deceased relative or others, and it's believed they come down and they light upon you. They help you with your task, uh, just like your telephone helps you, search something on Google or Bing or something like that, and they benefit in some way from it as well. Let's say they get advertising revenue. They cleanse a part of their soul. They get additional opportunity to do that, but they don't share in your sin, and they don't become blemished as a result because they've already done this process. Now, how does this relate to what we read and about the Father and the Son? It is likely that there was a man upon the earth. We know him as Gaius Julius Caesar, and he was the priest of Jupiter. And it is believed that he had uh, one aspect, if not all, of Jupiter within him, the Nefesh, Ruach, or Neshama of Jupiter. Now, the planet Jupiter has a soul, and it is possible to imagine that the soul of Jupiter, these are called, in some respects, Berry points, that most of them extend into the sun as kind of an anchor into the sun. The Berry point of Jupiter stops outside the sun, and there could be others which hold on to the moons, to the various satellites, and even to a person. The Berry point of Jupiter was within Gaius Julius Caesar, and he emitted it into a vial, uh, and through his semen, and that semen became the property of a Vestal Virgin by the name of Cleopatra the 7th, uh, who was the mother, eventually, through this process, of the last known pharaoh of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Ptolemy Soter. Then they uh, became kings and other things like that, because the spirit passed on and she gave birth to a son. It is my belief that that same person, despite whatever you see on television about Cleopatra the Seventh, she is a Vestal virgin, and she would not have done some of the terrible things. I mean, honestly, some of them are just sensuality, and those are just fine. But she would not have ever been entered uh, with the penis of a man into her vagina. That was against the law of the Vestal virgins, and there were significant. Uh, well, results that would have occurred from it. She gave birth to a child, uh, and that child, Ptolemy Soter, I believe, is Jesus Christ. And he then carried the soul of Jupiter with him. And Caesar, of course, on the Senate floor was assassinated, possibly even though he didn't enter. He was a virgin himself. He didn't sleep with women as part of his role as being a priest of Jupiter. Causing a Vestal virgin to get pregnant may have cost him his life. So he was killed, and Cleopatra the Seventh was about 13 years old at this point, and she was then included into uh, the home of another man. We know him as Saint Joseph. I won't go into his full background because it causes way too much confusion. And so, but he didn't. He marries her, and he doesn't. He keeps his vow, not only not to have physical intimacy with her, have sex with her, but also not to cause her to become pregnant. And he took another wife, who was the mother of St. James, and his brothers and sisters may have had the same mother or other wives of St. Joseph as a result. Again, this was something normal that happened at that time for men who were wealthy. So Jesus would have been born, if you're accepting all these things as facts, with the same uh, soul as Jupiter, as Gaius Julius Caesar had and passed down through his seminal fluid. He would have been born with that same soul. So, father, earthly father, and earthly son shared the same divine berry point as Jupiter. So they were both the same, uh, even though father and son, they shared the same soul. So even though father and son, they were both CEO at some point of the same company, as it were. If it weren't Jupiter, we can say it was Saturn. If you prefer, some people prefer it to have been Saturn, some people prefer it to have been Jupiter. Uh, but that is the way that it can be explained that this occurred. So that's something to keep in mind from a spiritual standpoint. When someone says the Father and the Son, but are one, what makes them one? What is the what is the joining point between them? It is that they share the same special soul together, uh, and that was what made them essentially the same, even though different. So that's one explanation I'll offer you for what Hegel is speaking of here, and how we can look at God. He is not limited by his unlimitedness. Continuing with the text, just as religion and religious worship consist in overcoming the antithesis of subjectivity and objectivity, so science too and philosophy have no other task than to overcome this antithesis by the medium of thought. The aim of knowledge is to divest the objective world that stands opposed to us of its strangeness, and, as the phrase is, to find ourselves at home in it, which means no more than to trace the objective world back to the notion, to our innermost self. We may learn from the present discussion the mistake of regarding the antithesis of subjectivity and objectivity as an abstract and permanent one. The two are wholly dialectical. The notion is at first only subjective, but without the assistance of any foreign material or stuff it proceeds, in obedience to its own action, to objectify itself. So too the object is not rigid and processless. Its process is to show itself as what is at the same time subjective, and thus form the step onwards to the idea. Anyone who, from want of familiarity with the categories of subjectivity and objectivity, seeks to retain them in their abstraction, will find that the isolated categories slip through his fingers before he is aware, and that he says the exact contrary of what he wanted to say. Infra section 2 of Encyclopedia section 194. Objectivity contains the three forms of mechanism, chimism, Chemism. Objectivity contains the three forms of mechanism, chimism, and teleology. The object of mechanical type is the immediate and undifferentiated object. No doubt it contains difference, but the different pieces stand, as it were, without affinity to each other, and their connection is only extraneous. In chimism, on the contrary, the object exhibits an essential tendency to differentiation in such a way that the objects are what they are only by their relation to each other. This tendency to difference constitutes their quality. The third type of objectivity, the teleology relation, is the unity of mechanism and chimism. Design, like the mechanical object, is a self-contained totality, enriched, however, by the principle of differentiation which came to the fore in chimism, and thus referring itself to the object that stands over against it. Finally, it is the realization of design which forms the transition to the idea. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the science of the idea in and for itself, billahi that wa lillahi jama'a, Chapter 9, third subdivision of logic, the doctrine of the notion, quasi-subdivision B, the object, infra-subdivision A, mechanism, and even though it is labeled 196, this is actually Encyclopedia section 195. The object, infra section number 1, in its immediacy is the notion only potentially. The notion as subjective is primarily outside it, and all its specific character is imposed from without. As a unity of difference, therefore, it is a composite, an aggregate. and its capacity of acting on anything else continues to be an external relation. This is formal mechanism, notwithstanding, and in this connection and non independence, the objects remain independent and offer resistance external to each other. Pressure and impact are examples of mechanical relations. Our knowledge is said to be mechanical or by rote when the words have no meaning for us, but continue external to sense, conception, thought, and when, being similarly external to each other, they form a meaningless sequence. Conduct, piety, and the like are in the same way mechanical. When a man's behavior is settled for him by ceremonial laws, by a spiritual advisor, and the like. In short, when his own mind and will are not in his actions, which in this way are extraneous to himself. Mechanism, the first form of objectivity, is also the category which primarily offers itself to reflection. As it examines the objective world, it is also the category beyond which reflection seldom goes. It is, however, a shallow and it is, however, a shallow and superficial mode of observation, one that cannot carry us through in connection with nature and still less in connection with the world of mind. In nature, it is only the various abstract relations of matter in its inert masses which obey the law of mechanism. In nature, it is only the various abstract relations of matter in its inert masses which obey the law of mechanism. On the contrary, the phenomena and operations of the province to which the term physical, in its narrower sense, is applied, such as the phenomena of light, heat, magnetism, and electricity, cannot be explained by any mere mechanical processes, such as pressure, impact, displacement of parts, and the like. Still less satisfactory is it to transfer these categories and apply them in the field of organic nature, at least if it be our aim, at least if it be our aim to understand the specific features of that field, such as the growth and nourishment of plants, or it may be even animal sensation. It is at any rate a very deep seated and perhaps the main defect of modern researches into nature that even where other and higher categories than those of mere mechanism are in operation, they still stick obstinately to the mechanical laws. Although they thus conflict with the testimony of unbiased perception, and foreclose the gate to an adequate knowledge of nature. But even in considering the formations in the world of mind, the mechanical theory has been repeatedly invested with an authority which it has no right to. Take as an instance the remark that man consists of soul and body. In this language, the two things stand each self-subsistent and associated only from without. Similarly, we find the soul regarded as a similarly we find the soul regarded as a mere group of forces and faculties subsisting independently side by side. Thus, decidedly must we reject the mechanical mode of inquiry when it comes forward and arrogates to itself the place of rational cognition in general, and seeks to get mechanism accepted as an absolute category. But we must not on that account forget expressly to vindicate for mechanism the right and import of a general logical category. It would be therefore a mistake to restrict it to the special physical department from which it derives its name. There is no harm done, for example, in directing attention to mechanical actions such as that of gravity, the lever, and such. Even in departments, notably in physics and in physiology, beyond the range of mechanics proper, it must, however, be remembered that within these spheres the laws of mechanism cease to be final or decisive, and sink, as it were, to a subservient position, to which may be added that in nature, when the higher or organic functions are in any way checked or disturbed in their normal efficiency, the otherwise subordinate category of mechanism is immediately seen to take the upper hand. Thus, a sufferer from indigestion feels pressure on the stomach after partaking of certain food in slight quantity, whereas those whose digestive organs are sound remain free from the sensation, although they have eaten as much. The same phenomenon occurs in the general feeling of heaviness in the limbs, experienced in bodily indisposition, even in the world of mind. Mechanism has its place, though thereto it is a subordinate one. We are right in speaking of mechanical memory and of all sorts of mechanical operations, such as reading, writing, playing on musical instruments, and the like. In memory, indeed, the mechanical quality of the action is essential. A circumstance, the neglect of which has not unfrequently caused great harm in the training of the young, from the misapplied zeal of modern educationalists for the freedom of intelligence. It would betray bad psychology, however, to have recourse to mechanism for an explanation of the nature of memory, and to apply mechanical laws straight off to the soul. The mechanical feature in memory lies merely in the fact that certain signs, tones, and the like are apprehended in their purely external association and then reproduced in this association without attention being expressly directed to their meaning and inward association, To become acquainted with these conditions of mechanical memory requires no further study of mechanics, nor would that study tend at all to advance the special inquiry of psychology. Encyclopedia section 194. The want of stability in itself, which allows the object to suffer violence, is possessed by it, see the preceding section, only in so far as it has a certain stability. Now, as the object is implicitly invested with the character of notion, the one of these characteristics is not merged into its other, but the object, through the negation of itself, its lack of independence, closes with itself, and not till it so closes is it independent. Thus, at the same time, in distinction from the outwardness and negativing that outwardness in its independence, does this independence form a negative unity with self, centrality, subjectivity. So conceived, the object itself has direction and reference towards the external. But this external object is similarly central in itself, and being so, is no less referred towards the other center, so that it no less has its centrality in the other. This is, in for section number 2, mechanism with affinity, with bias or difference, and may be illustrated by gravitation, appetite, social instinct, and the like. Before moving on to Encyclopedia section 197, there are times when, so there are two things. I'll start with what I was saying. There are times when intersections cross over into other paragraphs. And if you remember earlier when I said this was Encyclopedia section 195, even though in the text it's listed as 196, that whole 195 is about mechanism or being mechanical. And he also says the previous section without listing it. He does this. He may have some esoteric numerical reason for skipping 195. And I can imagine that 1 plus 9, well, plus 5 equals 15. 15 in the tarot, which comes from Italy and many, many centuries before that from Egypt, is the number of Satan. So he may have been skipping it the way that some people skip the 13th floor in a building to avoid the unlucky number 13, which has its origin also in the tarot, which is the tarot card of death. So these are things that he may have been skipping, but he also is saying he's not being uh, he's not being mechanistic. And I believe if you're going to Hegel will make you famous. Hegel will make you popular if you're using him now, maybe even at that time. So he is testing the one who is relaying his thought and making sure you're paying attention. And this is why, in the outline, which I have created and I'm editing until I finish the text, and I'll probably edit it as I go through it, I've created categories or I've indexed it in my own unique way. So the text becomes my own. And my goal is to affix it to another text that I've edited, heavily edited, called originally called the Fusus Hikam. The Fusus Hikam are the bezels or fissures of wisdom, and there are 27 different texts that talk about the Hebraic prophets and some Arabic prophets who were intermixed with them, from Adam to Muhammad, interspersed with Joseph and Jonah and Jesus. These are all there. And so I've rewritten it based on an English translation, something that looks like the person did a great job. Like they went through Google Translate and then went through and edit. And so that I would just get the immediate translation or whomever got it. I wasn't signed except for the numbers 121. And so I edited it. And I was also given a chart of maybe 10 concentric circles, which were related to these 27. And in it, you have a relationship between each one and a constellation or a lunar mansion, which has its relationship back to a text called the Picatrix, which has its origin with well, likely going back to Babylon, but it has its origin with the Ptolemaic dynasty around the year, maybe from the year 300 BCE to about the year 50 AD. And using an updated list of these lunar mansions, I've added each one and the constellation to the various prophetic individuals. I intend to affix my outline of Hegel to the beginning of it because you need some logical basis to really to benefit mostly from it. Because they're not just stories of the prophets. They are how the prophets thought more so than anything else, and then my additions. Also, so the science of logic is going to go first, and this is how I learned it. I also learned the science of epistemology before, or ontology, which is Hegel's philosophy of the mind. I plan to fix that afterwards. Once you've gone through the logic, you've gone through the text of the Hegel, which I call in different ways the musings of Ganymede, a lover's odyssey, where Ganymede, a figure from Greek mythology, is speaking to Jupiter, the king of the gods at that point, another figure from Greek mythology. But literally, Ganymede is a moon, a planet-sized moon that is in orbit around Jupiter, which is a gaseous planet. And so it's a conversation between these ensouled beings. And going from Hegel's logic to the processual hikam to Hegel's philosophy of mind, my hope is at the end of this 500 or 600 page book, overwhelmingly composed of previous traditions, a person will have some benefit, and that this benefit will last a very long time. So this will be recorded. I had a recording of the processual hikam, but I'm going to do it again, God willing. And then I also have a recording of the philosophy of mind and the outline already. So this is what I intend to do with it, and that will be my contribution to the world of sorts. And we'll see how that manifests itself, or maybe we won't see it, and it'll come out in some time in the future that it's beneficial. But there is a purpose to what I'm doing here, and so I'm trying to pass Hegel's test that I am useful to his process here, and I'm worthy of calling his name and using his name. Okay, Encyclopedia section 197. This relationship, when fully carried out, forms a syllogism. In that syllogism, the immanent negativity as the central individuality of an object, abstract center, relates itself to a non-independent, this relationship, when fully carried out, forms a syllogism. In that syllogism, the immanent negativity as the central individuality of an object, abstract center, relates itself to non-independent objects as the other extreme by a mean which unites the centrality with the non-independence of the objects, relative center. This is infrasection number 3, absolute mechanism. Encyclopedia section 198. The syllogism thus indicated, I M dash P M dash U, individual, particular, universal, is a triad of syllogisms. The wrong individuality of non-independent objects in which formal mechanism is at home is by reason of that non-independence no less universality, though it be only external. Hence these objects also form the mean between the absolute and the relative center, the form of syllogism being UM-IM-P, universal, individual, particular. For it is by this want of independence that those two are kept asunder and made extremes, as well as related to one another. Similarly, absolute centrality as the permanently underlying universal substance illustrated by the gravity which continues identical, which as pure negativity equally includes individuality in it, is what mediates between the relative center and the non-independent objects. The form of syllogism being PUI, particular, universal, independent. It does so no less essentially as a disintegrating force in its character of eminent individuality than in virtue of universality, acting as an identical bond of union and tranquil self-containedness. Like the solar system, so, for example, in the practical sphere, the state is a system of three syllogisms. Syllogism 1: the individual or person, through his particularity or physical or mental needs, which, when carried out to their full development, give civil society, is coupled with the universal, in essence, with society, law, right, government. Syllogism 2: the will or action of the individuals is the intermediating force which procures for these needs satisfaction in society, in law, and the like, and which gives to society, law, and the like, their fulfillment and actualization. Syllogism 3: but the universal, which is to say the state, government, and law, is the permanent, underlying mean in which the individuals and their satisfaction have and receive their fulfilled reality, intermediation, and persistence. Each of the functions of the notion, as it is brought by intermediation to coalesce with the other extreme, is brought into union with itself and produces itself, which production is self-preservation. It is only by the nature of this triple coupling, by this triad of syllogisms with the name termini, that a whole is thoroughly understood in its organization. Encyclopedia section 199. The immediacy of existence, which the objects have in absolute mechanism, is implicitly negatived by the fact that their independence is derived from and due to their connections with each other, and therefore to their own want of stability. Thus, The object must be explicitly stated as in its existence having an affinity or a bias towards its other, as not indifferent. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the science of the idea in and for itself, billahi that wa lillahi jama'a, Chapter 9, third subdivision of logic, the doctrine of the notion, quasi-subdivision B, the object, infra-subdivision B, chemism. If it's chemism, chem is an ancient name for Egypt. In effect, they're saying the way things were done are in Egypt, are are what you call chemistry, which has its origins in Egypt, things that are chemically together. So, salve et coagula, something that is dissolved to its basic elements and then brought back to a new whole to be useful. You dissolve iron, you dissolve a block of lead with a certain chemical, and within that block of lead, there are flecks of gold that have been trapped in it. Just as if you have a piece of uh, ruby quartz, you're going to have silicon as a major part of it, which is the quartz, but you're also going to have uh, uh, possibly some iron ore that has been made red in it. So you have iron, silicon dioxide, iron, or something like that, which makes a ruby quartz. If for some reason you're able to dissolve the silicon and get so the quartz is gone, you would be left with the iron of what makes it a ruby quartz, the red iron left over. Same thing here. So chemistry is the process of dissolving something down to an elemental form. And once it's there, it may not look the way you want it. You resolve it to a form that you want it in. So if you take a block of lead and you dissolve it with some acid or a particular type of laser, what you'll have left is gold, but the gold may be green in color. And so that you may need to resolve that green gold to make it golden or yellowish gold again through another process. And this is the coagulation. Encyclopedia section 200. The not indifferent, biased, object has an immanent mode which constitutes its nature, and in which it has existence. But as it is invested with the character of total notion, it is the contradiction between this totality and the special mode of its existence. Consequently, it is the constant endeavor to cancel this contradiction and to make its definite being equal to the notion. Chimism is a category of objectivity which, as a rule, is not particularly emphasized and is generally put under the head of mechanism. The common name of mechanical relationship is applied to both, in contradistinction to the teleological. There is a reason for this in the common feature which belongs to mechanism and chemism. In them, the notion exists, but only implicit and latent, and they are thus both marked off from teleology, where the notion has real independent existence. This is true, and yet chimism and mechanism are very decidedly distinct. The object in the form of mechanism is primarily only an indifferent reference to self, while the chemical object is seen to be completely in reference to something else. No doubt, even in mechanism, as it develops itself, there spring up references to something else, but the nexus of mechanical objects with one another is at first only an external nexus, so that the object in connection with one another still retain the semblance of independence. In nature, for example, the several celestial bodies which form our solar system compose a kinetic system and thereby show that they are related to one another. Motion, however, as the unity of time and space, is a connection which is purely abstract and external, and it seems, therefore, as if these celestial bodies, which are thus externally connected with each other, would continue to be what they are, even apart from this reciprocal relation. The case is quite different with chemism. Objects chemically biased are what they are expressly by that bias alone. Hence, they are absolute impulse toward integration by and in one another. Encyclopedia section 201. The product of the chemical process consequently is the neutral object, latent in the two extremes, each on the alert. The notion or concrete universal, by means of the bias of the objects, the particularity, coalesces with the individuality in the shape of the product, and in that only with itself. In this process, too, the other syllogisms are equally involved. The place of mean is taken both by individuality as activity and by the concrete universal, the essence of the strained extremes, which essence reaches definite being in the product. Encyclopedia section 202. Chemism, as it is a reflectional nexus of objectivity, has presupposed not merely the bias or non indifferent nature of the objects, but also their immediate independence. The process of chemism consists in passing to and fro from one form to another, which forms continue to be as external as before. In the neutral product, the specific properties which the extremes bore towards each other are merged. But although the product is conformable to the notion, the inspiring principle of active differentiation does not exist in it, for it has sunk back to immediacy. The neutral body is therefore capable of disintegration, but the discerning principle, which breaks up the neutral body into biased and strained extremes, and which gives to the indifferent object in general its affinity and animation towards another, that principle, and the process as a separation with tension, falls outside of that first process. The chemical process does not rise above a conditioned and finite process. The notion as notion is only the heart and core of the process, and does not in this stage come to an existence of its own. In the neutral product, the process is extinct, and the existing cause falls outside it. Encyclopedia section 203. Each of these two processes, the reduction of the biased, not indifferent, to the neutral, and the differentiation of the indifferent or neutral, goes its own way without hindrance from the other. but that want of interconnection shows that they are finite by their passage into products in which they are merged and lost. Conversely, the process exhibits the nonentity of the presupposed immediacy of the indifferent objects. By this negation of immediacy and of externalism in which the notion as object was sunk, it is liberated and invested with independent being in face of that externalism and immediacy. In these circumstances, it is the end, final cause. The passage from chemism to the teleological relation is implied in the mutual cancelling of both of the forms of the chemical process. The result thus attained is the liberation of the notion, which in chemism and mechanism was presented only in the germ, and not yet evolved. The notion in the shape of the aim or end thus comes into independent existence. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the science of the idea in and for itself, Bilahi that wa lillahi jama'a, Chapter 9, third subdivision of logic, the doctrine of the notion, quasi-subdivision B, the object, infra-subdivision C, teleology. Encyclopedia section 204. In the end, the notion has entered on free existence and has a being of its own. By means of the negation of immediate objectivity, it is characterized as subjective, seeing that this negation is, in the first place, abstract, and hence at first the relation between it and objectivity still one of contrast. This character of subjectivity, however, compared with the totality of the notion, is one-sided, and that be it added for the end itself, in which all specific characters have been put as subordinated and merged. For it, therefore, even the object, for it, therefore, even the object which it presupposes has only hypothetical, ideal reality, essentially no reality. The end, in short, is a contradiction of its self identity against the negation stated in it, in essence, its antithesis to objectivity, and being so, contains the eliminative or destructive activity which negates the antithesis and renders it identical with itself. This is the realization of the end, in which, while it turns itself into the other of its subjectivity and objectifies itself, thus cancelling the distinction between the two, it has only closed with itself and retained itself. The notion of design or end, while on one hand called redundant, is on another justly described as the rational notion, and contrasted with the abstract universal of understanding. The latter only subsumes the particular, and so connects it with itself, but has it not in its own nature the distinction between the end or final cause and the mere efficient cause, which is the cause ordinarily so called, is of supreme importance. Causes, properly so called, belong to the sphere of necessity, blind and not yet laid bare. The cause therefore appears as passing into its correlative and losing its primordiality, thereby sinking into dependency. It is only by implication, or for us, that the cause is in the effect made for the first time a cause, and that it there returns into itself. The end, on the other hand, is expressly stated as containing the specific character in its own self, the effect, namely, which in the purely causal relation is never free from otherness. The end, therefore, in its efficiency does not pass over, but retains itself. In essence, it carries into effect itself only, and is at the same it carries into effect itself only, and is at the end what it was in the beginning or primordial state. Until it thus retains itself, it is not genuinely primordial. The end then requires to be speculatively apprehended as the notion, which itself, in the proper unity and ideality of its characteristics, contains the judgment or negation, the antithesis of subjective and objective, and which to an equal extent suspends the antithesis. By end, however, we must not at once, nor must we ever merely think of the form which it has in consciousness as a mode of mere mental representation. By means of the notion of inner design, Kant has resuscitated the idea in general, and particularly the idea of life. Aristotle's definition of life virtually implies inner design, and is thus far in advance of the notion of design, and is thus far in advance of the notion of design in modern teleology, which had in view finite and outward design only. Animal wants Animal wants and appetites are some of the readiest instances of the end. They are the felt contradiction which exists within the living object, and pass into the activity of negating this negation which mere subjectivity still is. The satisfaction of the want or appetite restores the peace between subject and object. The object, the objective thing which, so long as the contradiction exists, in essence, so long as the want is felt, stands on the other side, loses this quasi independence by its union with the subject. Those who talk of the permanence and immutability of the finite, as well subjective as objective, may see the reverse illustrated in the operations of every appetite. Appetite is, so to speak, the conviction that the subjective is only a half truth, no more adequate than the objective. But appetite, in the second place, carries out its conviction. It brings about the supersession of these finites. It cancels the antithesis between the objective, which would be and stay an objective only, and the subjective, which in like manner would be and stay a subjective only. As regards the action of the end, attention may be called to the fact that in the syllogism which represents that action and shows the end closing with itself by the means of realization, the radical feature in the negation of the termini, That negation is the one just mentioned, both of the immediate subjectivity appearing in the end as such, and of the immediate objectivity seen. That negation is the one just mentioned, both of the immediate subjectivity appearing in the end as such, and of the immediate objectivity as seen in the means and the objects presupposed. This is the same negation as is in operation when the mind leaves the contingent things of the world as well as its own subjectivity and rises to God. It is the moment or factor which, as noticed in the introduction and Encyclopedia section 192, was overlooked and neglected in the analytic form of syllogisms under which the so-called proofs of the being of a God presented this elevation.